It was Canada's darkest day of the Second World War, the disastrous assault on the French port city of Dieppe, where in a matter of hours, hundreds of Canadians were killed and thousands more were taken prisoner. Next summer will mark the 70th anniversary. Now, all these years later, a Canadian documentary crew is returning to the very beach where so many fell, trying to make sense of a massacre.
This beach in northern France is one of those places where it's hard to control your imagination. If you know the story of what happened to thousands of Canadians on this spot, how much blood was spilled here, it's impossible not to walk the beach and think about the battle. It's a battle being recreated by a documentary team in the footsteps of the Canadian soldiers 7 decades ago. The crew is mostly Canadian, but the actors are volunteers, French citizens, appreciative of Canada's bloody sacrifice. The documentary will tell the story for the first time on location where it happened of Canada's darkest day of World War II. The day Frank Volterman lived through what he calls a massacre.
Well, I always called Dieppe a massacre because there were, as I say, they were hoarded and rushed and forced up the hill to Dieppe like sheep going to a slaughterhouse.
That's the way you look back at it?
Yeah. It was a massacre.
You know, these kids, these are French kids who are doing this, and they are doing it simply because they want to pay tribute to the Canadians who landed here on August 19th, which is absolutely amazing.
The scale of what happened August 19th, 1942 is hard to wrap your mind around all these years later. Stand in the Canadian cemetery just outside town and consider this. Our losses in Afghanistan over 10 years would be one row here. Most of these men were killed in one morning. The Canadian dead from Dieppe ended up in Nazi newsreels, propaganda shown in German theaters to rally the population. In the days after the raid, the news here at home was that Canadian troops had hit the enemy hard. Then came the truth. It was a disaster of epic proportions.
Without a doubt, Dieppe had the most impact of any battle in the Second World War for Canadians.
Canadian military historian David O'Keefe has studied what happened in Dieppe for 15 years. He doesn't give credit to the German defenses as much as he gives blame to the Allied planners.
It just strikes me as one of the worst plans ever created. The intent may have been wonderful, but the way that it was planned and carried out was absolute suicide.
In the summer of 1942, Nazi Germany was doing well in the war. Hitler controlled most of Europe. Canadian troops had been moved into Britain, but as a protection force. For 2 years, thousands of Canadian soldiers, an ocean away from home, trained for battle, but didn't see any. There was heavy political pressure in Canada to finally get our troops into the war. The Dieppe attack, Operation Jubilee, was supposed to be a one-day in-and-out surprise raid. 237 ships and landing crafts set out for France. On board, 50 U.S. Rangers, 1,000 British troops, and 5,000 Canadian soldiers.
We smoked our cigarettes and got a scotch if we could get it.
Volterman says no one showed any nervousness on the ride over, even if they were. You can't see the end of the war until the fighting starts, so they wanted the fighting to begin so they could eventually go home. Volterman says when the landing craft hit the beach, the door went down, he ran out and lost a friend within seconds.
My Corporal Bill Kennedy, he dived down to the dry part, and I got right beside him. I was standing beside him, and a shell landed beside him. It killed him, and it fractured my ankle. and went through the rest of the war with a fractured ankle.
There was no surprise. The Germans were ready and they were dug in. The Canadians were out in the open. For Nazis in these fortified bunkers, it was just a matter of waiting until the Canadians were in range and then mowing them down.
These were guys who trained for a couple of years, went through everything and anything, all the hell that is training, and then literally jumped into the landing craft, and as the landing craft ramps dropped down, machine guns swept in or mortars came down and wiped them out completely.
Before they fired
a shot.
The retreat was sounded before noon, but barely a third of the men made it back to Britain, and 90% of them were injured. Volterman made it, but barely.
I had my jaw fractured. I had my upper arm shattered, and then this other piece in my neck.
Sister Agnès Marie Valois was a 28-year-old nurse at the time of the raid. All these years later, she lives in a monastery just outside town. But that day in '42, she was in the hospital as it filled up with wounded Canadians.
On a passé des nuits et des nuits sans dormir. Ah oui.
The staff went days and days without sleeping, she says. But it was the next day that she earned her nickname, the Angel of Dieppe. She walked the beaches, checking the corpses for unconscious injured soldiers. At times, she had to get in between the injured and Nazis to prevent executions. Sister Agnès Marie says she still has trouble believing it actually happened. It wasn't war, she says, it was, and then she uses that word.
Un massacre.
A massacre. Back in Dieppe, German cameramen captured the images, the beaches littered with tanks and bodies. 907 Canadians were killed. Almost 2,000 were taken prisoner. They'd spend the next 2 years in POW camps, much of it in shackles. This is the beach in the village of Prie, the eastern flank in '42. They called it Blue Beach. The stone wall has barely changed since the dead laid here all those years ago. This is the photo from the Dieppe Raid. One Nazi soldier, his back to the camera, literally dozens of dead Canadians at his feet. As much as Dieppe has changed over the 7 decades, and it has, there are still so many spots like this one that you recognize from the many pictures and films from back then. And you can't help but think this is where those men were. It's for that reason that when the Canadian documentary team wanted to recreate what happened in Dieppe, they came to its beaches, the very place where the lives were lost.
Macabre feeling here.
Yeah, it's a little eerie, isn't it?
The documentary will be released next summer to coincide with the 70th anniversary. It will look at a question that has never been answered, not in 7 decades, at least not fully, they say. Why did it happen?
Next,
Dieppe hasn't forgotten about the Canadians.
sacrifice remembered.
Action!
There have been documentaries and films on the disastrous raid in 1942 before, but never like this.
Okay, look up! Boom, 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 boom!
The blood that was spilled on these stones on this exact spot. It's something the man behind the lens couldn't help but think about.
It truly affects you because you can just go right back in time.
Documentary filmmaker Wayne Abbott.
It's an incredible place to land. I mean, you stand here and you question, what were they thinking? I mean, this is probably single-handedly one of the worst places to do an amphibious landing.
And one of the best places to defend.
One of the easiest places to defend. I mean, I think the Germans must have shook their heads, going, why?
For decades, the belief was that the mission was a hit-and-run raid. The idea, to inflict damage on the Nazis, test the Allied troops, test German defenses, and pull back. Well, the documentary Dieppe uncovered will look at what should have happened. Was there a secret mission never revealed in 70 years? There are fewer and fewer every year, but there are still people here who lived under Nazi occupation.
Action. Go.
Filming downtown, this woman stopped us to talk about life as a scared teen all those years ago. But I asked about how it felt seeing the reenactors dressed as Nazis. Watch her face change.
Ça, c'est les uniformes que les Allemands portaient. Est-ce que c'est étrange de voir ça?
Oh, j'ai pas mon souvenir de ça.
I don't have good memories about that, she says. I don't want to think about it. Life under the Nazis left its scars, and on occasion, you see them.
Go, 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 go.
It's one thing to be dressed as a Canadian or a British soldier here. It's another to stand in the street in a Nazi uniform with a swastika on your chest. He says he once had a woman yell, "You took my husband," and throw a pot at him. He says he knows it's sensitive. There are reminders here of what happened. The Nazi pillboxes and bunkers were built to last, and they do. For the locals, they're historical bookmarks to a horrible chapter. But for a Canadian visiting, walk around and there are reasons to feel pride. The maple leaf doesn't just fly once a year for the anniversary here, it flies every day. There's a Canada Street, an Avenue of the Canadians, and a Canada Park. There are the big monuments and the small ones. This one sits in the shadows of a centuries-old church with a simple inscription, "Here, on the 19th of August, 1942, fell 2 Canadian soldiers."
Dieppe hasn't forgotten about the Canadians, and that's one thing that I think everybody should know. It is a little bit of Canada right here.
Victories like Vimy Ridge and Juno Beach are celebrated and remembered. Failures like Dieppe aren't forgotten completely, but they aren't remembered the same way.
I don't think you have to be a military historian or somebody with a military background to understand the nature of what happened here. I mean, it's amazing how Canadians will make a pilgrimage every once in a while to Vimy, but you need to make one to Dieppe.
Next, if companies tried to sell us something for free,
the product was goodness.
Would we buy it?
It was Canada's darkest day of the Second World War, the disastrous assault on the French port city of Dieppe, where in a matter of hours, hundreds of Canadians were killed and thousands more were taken prisoner. Next summer will mark the 70th anniversary. Now, all these years later, a Canadian documentary crew
were hoarded and rushed and forced up the hill to Dieppe like sheep going to a slaughterhouse.
That's the way you look back at it?
Yeah. It was a massacre.
You know, these kids, these are French kids who are doing this, and they are doing it simply because they want to pay tribute to the Canadians who landed here on August 19th, which is absolutely amazing.
Steps of the Canadian soldiers 7 decades ago. The crew is mostly Canadian, but the actors are volunteers, French citizens, appreciative of Canada's bloody sacrifice. The documentary will tell the story for the first time on location where it happened of Canada's darkest day of World War II. The day Frank Volterman lived through what he calls a massacre.
Well, I always called Dieppe a massacre because there were, as I say, there
This beach in northern France is one of those places where it's hard to control your imagination. If you know the story of what happened to thousands of Canadians on this spot, how much blood was spilled here, it's impossible not to walk the beach and think about the battle. It's a battle being recreated by a documentary team in the footsteps.
He's returning to the very beach where so many fell, trying to make sense of a massacre.